Yeah. Hi. So we have a bunch of very good topics today that are kind of focused on maybe code and development and this developer life, right? But I would like to start you off with something a bit closer to the tangible kind of like end user experience thing. So for example, let's say you're given a view to develop something new in your application, some new application, something pretty simple like this. If you're a seasoned developer, you might already be thinking in terms of components, for example. You already know, okay, there's a button, buttons behave that way, this is how they could look, there's the different variations, and so on. But what if I told you that even something simple like this has a bunch of aspects about it that might not be immediately noticeable from just the design itself, the handover that you might get. And for many of us, it might be immediately noticeable also when we are browsing the web. And I admit that I'm making some assumptions here. When I say many of us, I mostly mean people who can see, people who mostly use the mouse or a touch device to browse the web. So my name is Stepan, hi, and I am a senior accessibility front-end engineer at Splunk. What Splunk does is basically help you aggregate, collect a bunch of very, very big amounts of machine-generated data, process them, and then make sense of them. So that includes pretty complicated multi-step searches, pretty involved dashboards, and pretty high-fidelity visualizations. So as an accessibility engineer, I have a lot of work. It's a lot of fun to be there. And there's a lot of different processes that go into work as an accessibility engineer. But today I want to focus on something easier, something that I think everybody can take back to work tomorrow. A couple of examples of entire components or entire interaction workflows that are often overlooked in even very involved, very big, important projects that are actually pretty simple to add. And in the end, they have a very big impact on the usability, not just for people who experience some disabilities when using the web, but also just regular everyday users. And hopefully what this might inspire at least some of you to do is to think more accessibility first, which, as I said already, is better for all sorts of users, but also for me personally, for example. It's just a fun little challenge in addition to what you would do otherwise as a front-end engineer. And if any of you are business startup founders, people, it might be important to your business at one point to be compliant with different government regulations that are already working right now. For example, the ADA in the USA and the European Accessibility Act in the EU. All right, let's start with something simple, buttons, right? Like you might have noticed already in the example before, there's a very familiar menu button over there. But the only reason we know that this is a menu button, that these 3 slides mean that this is a menu, is because we've been slowly boiling over maybe last 15 years of the way tech and UIs have been developing, right? The sad reality is that actually icon-only buttons, even though they are super popular in all sorts of UIs, are a nightmare, not only for accessibility, but for UX in general. So number one, there are very few icons that have a consistent and clear meaning to them. You've probably seen this top example in a lot of applications recently, and somehow we as a society have decided that it means AI, but why? Why does that mean that? And also, what sort of AI does it mean? When you click it, does it open some kind of a chat bot? Does it rearrange your entire screen? You can't really know. And this lower example, I'm not exactly sure what it's supposed to be at all, really. Number two, even when there are icons that could be more understandable, they are widely inconsistent across different applications. So these 2 examples, it looks exactly the same, but it does exactly different things in different applications. In Facebook, this little camera icon is create a chat room, and in YouTube, it's upload a video. And well, there's a lot of examples from that. And lastly, there's a lot of uncertainty to when there are icon-only buttons. As a user, you might not know what will happen, so you might be a bit hesitant to even click of them. And there's a research case from Microsoft where the Outlook toolbar turns out that when it had only icons, there were big amounts of users that were not using them at all. And as soon as they added more text, well, people knew what to do, so they started using them more. So instead, whenever possible, it is good to either use full text or use a text in addition to icon. That will help in a lot of different cases. But OK, I understand that in a lot of cases, it's not very plausible. You might have space constraints. You might have any other reasons why you want to use icons. But OK, number one, first component that I want to introduce to you is the humble tooltip. So a tooltip could solve this issue for you. It's just an additional textual information that appears before you interact with some kind of a component. It could be a button. It could be something else. And it provides more context to what it is. Super easy to add. In just this, I want to say, is maybe ballpark 25 lines of just HTML and CSS. And you could have this show up. It works on every browser. And it also works when you hover over your button, or even when you use keyboard, when you focus the button. So me, as a developer, I love using just the keyboard to browse the web as well. I don't like reaching out for the mouse. Maybe there are other people here as well who are kind of similar. OK, 25 lines, HTML, CSS, cool. Might not be applicable. Most of you probably use libraries, component libraries, design systems at work. And that's all right. A lot of them have this. But one thing that you should note is that when you're using another tooltip solution, one thing that needs to work is that the tooltip text needs to be tied to what it is describing. In HTML, we have basically two ways of doing that, with the area labeled by or the area label attribute. One of them, area label, is when you provide the text itself. And the other one is labeled by, where you link to the element that provides the text. And this is how assistive technologies like screen readers and also dictation software, for example, which is important for a lot of different users, know what the button means, know what the tooltip is tied to. The same labels can actually be added to a lot of different elements, not all of them even interactive. So you'll know in HTML there's navigation bars, sections, lists, and all of those things. Well, you can actually add these same labels with the same ways for those elements. And this way, for people who, for example, use the voiceover software on macOS for interacting with the web, they will have a better overview of your website, of your application. They can understand better what is being displayed on screen right now. And they can also use the software to navigate exactly to some specific point in your website. So there's a shortcut that you press, and it brings up this landmark menu, which shows all of the labeled things. Every menu that you added a label to, every section, every list. And you can see what kind of things there are on the page and go exactly to them right away. OK, cool. So we have buttons. Let's say we actually do add a text to them. One more problem about buttons and about accessibility software is that, again, me as a seeing person, I can see the entire screen at the same time. So when I see the share button or delete button over there, I can put it in context. I can see that there is a border around this card. So this button has to do with that card, for example. But screen reader software just focuses on one specific context at one time. So you would only see that this is a button that is called share. Not super helpful, already very helpful, but we can do better. We can add a hidden hint in HTML. So instead of saying just share, we would say share profile.png or something related to what this button does, but then hide it. Bad news, you can't hide it like this. If you use display none, if you use visibility hidden and these regular CSS things, it's completely hidden from all technologies as if it didn't exist. Good news, we can do better. People have already done research on that. It's typically called SR only or screen reader text or something like that. And there's specific ways how to hide content so that it's hidden visually, but still present for crawlers, robots, assistive technologies, all of the things like that. And you don't have to copy-paste it either. If you're using, probably a lot of you are using something like Tailwind, Bootstrap, any number of those component libraries and utility frameworks, they typically do have something like this available. again, it's called mostly like screen reader text or SR only or something like this. In Splunk, our design system is available for everybody to see, actually. And in Splunk, we expose this as a React component, screen reader content. So you can use this in any number of buttons or other elements that to add more context to your users. OK, let's zoom out for a little bit and look at navigation in general. The way that you navigate through web with the keyboard is by pressing the tab key over and over again, right? Like you press the tab, it goes to the first item, you press the tab, and it moves through buttons, through inputs, through links, and all of that. You might notice that this here already has a lot of elements that are potentially interactive that could that fall into this order of tabbing through the website. And there are some parts of it that might not be relevant to you at all times. For example, the stop part. The menu is probably repeated on every single page. And when you are jumping from page to page, well, you're not really interested in talking to the main menu. You probably want to jump specifically to the main content of the website. For that, component number 2, or actually number 3 already, is the skip link. You might have seen them if you are a frequent keyboard user on the web. You might not have seen them. But basically, the simple solution to this kind of problem is to add a link as the very first thing in your UI, and then hide it visually, but reveal it when it gets keyboard focus. And again, this is something that is very easy to add, even fewer lines of code, something like 15, I want to say. And this will already give you a link like this that only appears when you start using the keyboard to tab around the page. It is already a good upgrade for all sorts of users, assistive technologies, but also just people who like to keep their hands on the keyboard all the time, like me. But this gives you an opportunity to look more into what you can provide to your users that you know better than anybody else. So instead of just giving this one link, Google has actually 2 skip links in the search results. One for skipping to main content, and one that tells you just in general what they have done for accessibility on this page. The website for the ARIA authoring guidelines, which is, I'll talk about it later a bit more, has an entire menu that appears as the first thing on the page. It lets you go to any number of headings on that page, any specific landmarks around there. It's really good stuff. And LinkedIn, for example, as well, they include several landmarks. So right away, you can skip either to search, which I guess is one of the main things you do on the LinkedIn homepage, or you can go to main content, or again, you can see more information about how they handle accessibility in general throughout the page. OK, so I know this is TallinnJS, and this has been just HTML and CSS for now. I'm sorry, but this is the foundation for a lot of accessibility for a lot of UI, after all. Now I can talk a little bit about JavaScript as well. So focus. Most of the time, this tabbing interaction that I mentioned before, that you tab from one element to the other, you don't want to mess with it. People already have their own ways that they're used to using their computer and the browser and the keyboard. And interfering with how they use that is usually not really a good user experience for anyone involved. But there are a couple of kind of edge cases where it's good to give a helping hand to the user. Or there are, for example, some patterns that are assumed to be done a little bit differently than what the browsers give to you in the beginning. One of the examples is a dialog. So there's another animation here on the bottom left. You can see the keys that are being pressed. And basically, this is a dialog that is open on top of other web content. And when the user tabs around the page, we don't want them to be able to go to something that's outside of the dialog. Something that's, sometimes there's a dimmed background that hides everything. Well, yeah, you don't want the user to just go into the search bar that's somewhere hidden under that. And unfortunately, if you just open a div and just make the dimmable thing behind it, then the focus will escape. So how do we prevent that from happening? This technique has several names. I like calling it trapping focus, even though it's a little bit aggressive maybe. But it's actually, again, kind of simple. When the modal opens, number one thing that you want to do is start listening to key presses on the entire modal. Then you want to figure out all of the different elements inside of the modal that the user could possibly activate or could get to focus. And detect whether the user is moving right now from something that is not in the model itself. And when you detect that the user is trying to escape, then you just force the focus on the first focusable element in the model. It's important to also pay attention to shift being pressed, because if you press tab, you go to the next element. If you hold shift and you press tab, then you go to the previous. So if we go back, 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 and try to escape, then we would expect to arrive at the last element, not the first one. One more thing about kind of similar case is something called a roving tab index. Sometimes you might have widgets that have so many different interactive elements inside of them. A good example is a date picker or any sort of calendar. Every single day, every single maybe weekday header over there could be interactive, but you don't want people to go tap, 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 tap 10 times to arrive at March 10th. What is assumed and what is kind of generally accepted as a better interaction in these cases is to have the whole widget just one focusable element, and then arrow keys and other keys can be used to navigate inside of it. The same goes, for example, for combo boxes or regular selects. The same goes for radio button groups and a bunch of other widgets as well. Again, not that hard to add. Let's go through it. Oh yeah, for example, tab bar. So when you have a navigation on the website that is kind of like divided into tabs, then this is one of those UI flows that have agreed to be more effective if you use the keyboard, if you use the roving tab. So instead of going from images to videos to documents with the tab key, you would go into the tab bar and then use the arrow keys to go between those things. All right, how do we do that? Let's have a simple markup over here of the same tabs. Number one, you want to set one of those elements, whether it's days in a calendar or tabs in a tab group, as interactive. And for that, we use the tab index attribute and set it to 0. So tab index can have one of three possible values. It's either 0, which means I am interactive. It's -1, which means I'm not interactive. Or it's any positive number, which it's hard to explain, but never use that. Nobody ever used that. Please don't use that. Number two, every other element we set as not interactive for now. What this results in is that the user can set the focus on images, but not any of the other tabs. Then we, again, start listening for key presses. And when the user presses one of the arrow keys, then there's three things we kind of need to do. Number one is we find where the focus is right now, which element has the tab index of 0, which is set as interactive. And then we find what is the next element that the user wants to go to. Do they go right or do they go left, previous, next, and so on. We set the previous element that the focus was on before as not interactive. So we update the tab index to -1. Then we set the next element as interactive, setting the tab index to 0. So they're switching it up before the one that was active before and the one we want to go to. And lastly, we set the focus on the new element forcibly. And that's it. That's, again, maybe 20, 30 lines of code. And you can apply this to any number of elements. If you have a custom calendar, if you have anything else that you think would use from this interaction, you can go and apply it right now. And final interaction, final component that I want to talk about today are screen reader announcements. As I mentioned before, when you look at a screen, when you look at UI, you see the entire context. But when you use something like a screen reader for interacting with the UI, you only see the specific button, the specific element that you are interacting with. So what if something happens somewhere elsewhere on the page? For example, you have a feed that live loads other content from some other sources, and it gets new information. But if you, as a screen reader user, are working on some form on the other side of the page, you will not know about that. Or, for example, if some process is updated, process is done, there's a notification, anything happens somewhere, right? So for that, we have something called our live region. And that is the simplest of all of these things today. This is just an HTML element that has the attribute of aria-live that says polite or something else. And whenever the content of this HTML element changes, then the screen reader will know that, OK, this is something that I need to announce. This is something that I will read out. Polite means that the screen reader will wait for the user to be idle, to not be actively typing. And assertive means that they will be a bit more aggressive about it. And as soon as something changes, they will interrupt the user and say what they have to say. You probably want to use polite most of the time. This is just for general updates. And assertive is something that you can use for time-sensitive, very critical, something that you need to act on right now. And again, you can just set any sort of text, just plop it into inner HTML, and no matter where on the page the user presently is, they will get this announcement of whatever text you set on there. So that's basically the 6 sort of components, 6 elements, 6 interactions that I wanted to introduce to you today. As I hope you agree, they're pretty simple to add. They're pretty practical. And they are pretty applicable to all sorts of users, no matter if you're using an assistive software or if you're just using the keyboard or just in general. There's much more that goes into accessibility work, of course. This is just scratching the surface. There's so much work around semantics. There's so many visual different things that you need to think about if you truly want to be thinking accessibility first. But this is just a lot to think about, which is why in many companies, people like me and my team exist who are dedicated to working on this full time. The good news is that there are people who have done a lot of research and a lot of writing about what are the good practices surrounding all of these things. And if there is one link, if there is one page that I would like people to know from this entire talk, is the WCAG, it's a mouthful, is ARIA APG, Authoring Practices Guide, that has a lot of wonderful materials on what are the different components, what are the different flows, how to implement them, and also why they are useful, why they are important. So I hope from this you can see some very applicable, very simple little things that you can take to work right away. And that's it from me. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Actually, yeah.
Do we have one mic only? Do we have another mic? Okay.
You can ask.
Yeah, so you mentioned about the tab index.
Yeah.
That we have to use the 0 or 1. So my question, if I want to use like the serial of the element, like up and down, in this case, can I use also the number 2, 3? But you said always avoid it. So.
Yeah, so good question. So basically, tab index attribute, it can be -1, it can be, well, actually, it can be a negative number, or 0, or a positive number. Anything negative means not interactive. Anything 0 means just normally interactive. But anything positive number means this is the number which you are in the page flow. So if you have a button and you set, for example, tab index to 2, that means that this button will be forced to be the second element. And it's not recommended to use because it kind of messes with the logical layout of the page. If you look at what the page is, if you read the code of what the page is, then you would expect the tab to move, from element to element, from line to line. But here you can force them to just like jump around. And it's very hard to keep track of it. So I understand where it can be useful when you're authoring some pages, but it's just further down the line, 2 months later, you will be like, oh, why is this like that? And it's very hard to keep track of.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I have a scenario-like question.
OK.
Just for curiosity. So imagine we have a page. It's already done. And then we ask to make another page for user who has a total voice navigation system. And all buttons in place. But what you're thinking about this situation? Would you keep all these buttons in the place? Would you eliminate all this stuff, keeping in mind that you can use your voice for everything, basically? What your way of thinking is this combination of visual stuff and in other channels, in this particular case, voice?
Yeah. So one of the, whenever people talk about assistive technologies, and me as well, we kind of focus on screen readers and keyboards and stuff like that. Like this is kind of front of the line thinking. But one very popular technology is dictation. So it's just like you talk to the computer. If you have some mobility issues, for example, you might want to just use your voice to talk to the computer, to tell the computer what to do. And actually, one applicable thing from this talk today is when you have buttons. So a person who is using dictation, they might say, press settings button. But then the markup of the button needs to say that it's settings. If you use an icon that has like a cog, then it might keep people guessing. Like, do I say cog button? Do I say settings button? What do I expect there to be? So there is this trying to mark up interactive elements in a way that they are logical, as much as possible, like to give as objective as possible a meaning to every visual element, basically, as well as every textual element. And if we're talking about like a completely separate UI that is voice first, then you probably, if you want to separate it from like the, so say, old visual buttons and inputs sort of thing, then yeah, you probably want to start from scratch, see what you can take over, see what you don't need to take over, because it might be a completely different kind of interaction.
Thank you for a great presentation. I have a simple question about the tooltip. You showed the cases for desktop, but what about touch screens? There's no solution, just only usable text?
Kind of, yeah. It's preferred, for sure. Because in some cases, what I've seen done is a double interaction sort of thing. So you have whatever interactive element, the first time you tap, it shows the tooltip. The second time you tap, it actually does what it's doing. But I think you can agree that in most cases, it's a little bit overkill. It's a little bit clunky. So yes, for just touchscreen interfaces, having text is king. It's really the best solution to these problems. And of course, you know your users. If there is sufficient, let's say, education to what your UI is, what is your iconography, what is your visual language, then maybe it's OK in specific issues to just use icons, because you can expect the kind of person who comes in having a touch screen to know what it means.